Welcome to the Handheld Press Book Club. We are here on the 2nd of February talking about Elizabeth von Arnim's The Caravanners. And we have two special guests, Juliane Roemhild from La Trobe University in Australia. Juliane, can you wave your hand so we can see where you are?
Hello.
And we have Isobel Maddison from Lucy Cavendish College, Cambridge. Isobel, can you wave your hand?
Hello.
Juliane wrote the introduction to the Handheld Press edition of the Caravanners, and Isobel and Juliane kindly asked me to come and give a talk, and that at the Elizabeth von Arnim Society conference in France, and that was 2 years ago, and I think that was the last time I went abroad. And that was great because then I met several of the society, and that was really interesting. And then the Caravanners came out, and it's been a great hit. And now we're going to talk about it. I'm going to flip now to speaker view so we can see the speakers. And I'll ask Isobel and Juliane to begin your conversation. I will jump in occasionally if I see fit. The rest of you, could you turn off your microphones in case of dogs barking, cuckoos cuckooing, that kind of thing? If you want to ask questions, can you put them in the chat and I'll pick them up after Isobel and Juliane have done their thing. So over to you, Isobel.
Hi, Juliane. So it's good to be interview you. I really enjoyed your introduction. That's the first thing to say. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about this idea of German culture that you discuss in that introduction. If you can give us some sort of wider context to the novel.
Okay. Yeah, I think I think I wrote this in the introduction. What von Arnim does is I think she tries to contrast two very different ideas of what it means to be civilized and what it means to be sophisticated. And this idea of culture is, as I try to explain, it's quite inward looking. It's all about its personal refinement. And it's about developing your inner self, developing your spirituality, developing your sense of appreciation of beauty, your sensibility for nature, your sensibility for art. And as such, it is very much a concept that is grounded in romanticism. And yeah, it takes quite an inward turn. It's certainly also something to do with the political situation in Germany. I mean, it was during the Romantic period. Germany wasn't a unified country. It consisted of many different tiny nation states. So travel was quite difficult at times because you had to cross ever so many borders. And also the political situation was in the early 19th century extremely conservative after the Napoleonic Wars. So people actually really turned inward. Yeah. And there was a whole, after Romanticism came a whole literary movement called Biedermeier, which was all about retiring to your cottage, cultivating your small bourgeois inner circle. And of course, that's very much in contrast to the English concept of civilization, which is very outward looking and is derived from the French concept of sophistication, of being cosmopolitan, being sophisticated, being well-versed, probably also well-traveled. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It's really interesting to me because having reread the Caravanners over the last couple of days, it has seemed to me that this idea of how one develops oneself is very much written in right from the very start in this novel, which is an early one, 1909. And I'm very interested, as you know, in ideas of von Arnim and her socialism, broadly speaking. And many of those concepts actually are played out in this novel in a way I had not initially realized. So this idea of self-improvement, particularly if you're thinking about Fabian socialism, is actually about a sort of egality that grows out of self-development. So it's a really political thing in terms of UK socialism. This idea, Oscar Wilde writes The Soul of Man Under Socialism in the 1890s, and he makes this marvelous claim that if you develop yourself, ultimately you will give away your property if you're a landowner, and you will aspire to develop other people, and you'll become much less destructively individualistic. So it is quite interesting to me that those two strands are kind of pulling against each other in this novel.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a really good point. And sort of in contrast, the German idea of culture as von Arnim, or Kultur as von Arnim sees it and plays it off against that socialist Fabian Strand, is very, very elitist. And of course, she undermines it by actually having somebody claim to be highly cultured who really isn't.
Yes.
So, I mean, there were very highly cultured elites in Germany, indeed. But Ottringel is not really one of them. And what she kind of demonstrates is what happens if that is hollowed out to a facade. What happens if we can pretend to be highly cultured, but really there's nothing much behind it. Yeah, and it results in a kind of elitism and authoritarianism in Ottringel's case.
Yes, I mean, I think we should perhaps talk about him as a character. I think since he's the main narrator, he's the only complete male narrator of one of von Arnim's novels. And I know Kate asked us a question early on and said, you know, did actually von Arnim like her husband? We know she was married to Henning Prussian Junker, Henning von Arnim. It seems to me, it's always seemed to me that actually she's not in any way criticizing one particular person. I think in The German Garden, the Man of Wrath is playful, but also I think it's quite interesting just to think about her view on the Prussian Junker. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think she came out quite jaded, and Henning von, I don't think this is a portrait of Henning von Arnim Schlagenteam at all, but I think he's a type. He's she tries to probably distill everything that she disliked and found dangerous about Prussian aristocracy and the Junkers, the land-owning aristocracy, which would have been similar to the gentry, probably higher on the social ladder. But I think she tries to distill everything that she dislikes and finds dangerous about this. And her views get sharpened in the novel of Christine, which is of course written during World War I, when also the anti-German propaganda was at its full height, and you've written about invasion literature, and she really sort of sharpens it into a portrait of a cultural and political elite that is indeed highly cultured, but that doesn't actually, being cultured doesn't prevent great brutality and a lust for war. The two of them can actually go together, and I think this is what she really sort of distills and crystallizes here. And I don't think it has necessarily anything to do with Henning. They might have had a very tempestuous marriage at times, but I think there was also, at least that's my reading of it, a great sense of fondness and sort of a warmth and respect for each other between them. She did much later in a letter to her daughter Beatrix, with whom she shared a great love of Richard Wagner, who of course the Wagner family also held rather doubtful, very right-wing political views. And Henning von Arnim Schlagenteam was connected with them. He was acquainted with them, and he introduced von Arnim to them. And much later, she wrote in a letter to her daughter that she was reading something about Wagner and the family, and she said, no, I actually recognize some of those views that your father held in this kind of ideology in reading about Wagner. So I think there are probably sort of points where you can see she draws from personal acquaintance, but I don't think it's a portrait of Henning at all.
No, I agree with you. It's interesting because there have been so many conflicting views about her relationship with Henning. That he wanted to stop her from writing, that it was embarrassing to him, that she would be writing commercial fiction, and that's why she develops this pseudonym. But there's also been, I think it's Jennifer Walker in particular argues that actually he was hugely supportive of her writing, career. And I've got a photograph here. I don't know if anybody can see it. But it's one actually that really complicates the relationship between them, even taking, adding to one side actually that we don't think the Baron in the Caravanners is him. I don't know if anybody can see this, but this is here. This is Henning and Elizabeth, or May as she was known at this point, having really quite a moment in their garden. So in a sense, there were at least moments of kind of connection between them early on in the relationship, which I think is important. The other thing I suppose to be thinking about is that he dies in 1910 and spends a lot of the 1900s actually in in the UK, and I was sort of thinking about, well, when did she write the Caravanners, and how was it possible to write such a portrait from Germany? But it seems almost certainly that she wrote it from the UK, looking back retrospectively, and as you say, sort of sharpening her perspective about the Prussian Junker. I'm thinking about the solitary suffers. Yes, please go.
Can I just maybe add one point? If we are to look for a figure, then it's something that I said in the foreword, and I've been thinking about it. And if he's really, and if Ottering was really modeled on anybody, then to me, as I was sort of reading around it, there seemed to be some striking resemblances with Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, with whom he shares various personality traits. And the Kaiser was making increasingly headlines about sort of his very bad handling of foreign political affairs, his narcissism, his instability, his volatility. And his inability to sort of quite literally read the room. So I think if we're looking for a model, then to me it seems that's a much closer model. Yeah.
That's quite interesting then, because if you're thinking about anti-invasion literature, one of the best known books is When William Came, of course, which is Kaiser Wilhelm, and is a similar portrait of, you know, if the UK is sort of invaded by Kaiser Wilhelm and by people that are actually cast really as stereotypes here, but carry some of the traits that are important to the to thinking about the Prussian Junker. In The Solitary Summer, I just think it's not new, is it? This idea, this caricature of the Prussian Junker, because in The Solitary Summer, in the house, the narrator Elizabeth has to billet German Prussian troops and finds it almost intolerable and keeps leaving the house so she doesn't have dinner and so. So it's quite an interesting idea that you're raising about that sort of sharpening of her perception. It's there right from the beginning, actually, as a critique of kind of a hierarchical way of viewing the world, as you say, a kind of elitism, but also very important about sort of gender distinctions and the role of women. That's there right from the beginning, and is writ large in this novel. I mean, I wondered, I know, thinking about your paper actually, Kate, at Toulon, we talked a lot about, well, is von Arnim, is she a feminist? What is she doing? And I think lots of us have gone away and thought about this. I have my own view, but I'd like to think particularly about what's your feeling about women in the Caravanners, particularly Edelgard and the shortening of her skirts and that sort of resistance. I wonder how far you think she goes in this novel.
For me or for Juliane?
Yeah. Is that for Kate or for me?
No, it's for you, Juliane, and then Kate.
Okay.
We'll have you next, if that's okay.
Thank you. Well, I think from an English perspective, she's probably not actually going that far, but she uses it, I mean, in the transformation of Edelgard. I think we must also not forget that she is, of course, describing a very idealized England and sort of her ideal travel company. And she kind of, you know, as I said, she caricatures and she idealizes. But I think what she does do is, by drawing such a sharp contrast, make her readers realize how far women have come, but also how far they still have to go, and that there's a sense of not taking this for granted, because undoubtedly some of the views that Ottering has were not that foreign to English husbands either. I mean, she describes a particularly idealized, enlightened kind of companionship between Menzies-Lee and presumably you know, the pending marriage of Jalaby and Frau von Ektem, and he is a total feminist. Jalaby is, and so I think she sort of draws an idealized portrait of what she wants there to be. Is she a feminist? I think she is, undoubtedly. Jennifer Shepherd, who you've used the wonderful term, or I found a very productive term, cultural feminism, that doesn't necessarily sort of amount to outright suffragism or militant feminism, but has a very deep sense of justice and perhaps can be quite pragmatic. And, you know, short skirts are pragmatic. It's very much about freedom of movement, and freedom of movement for her is, of course, crucial. Women need to be able to move. Women need to be able to have space, and I think that movement is always comes together with growth, personal growth. So I think in that sense, writing about personal growth for women writing about change, to me, that's a very feminist sort of undertaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly interesting, your idea of movement in the Caravanners, because if we're thinking about territoriality, for example, and these very binary ideas of this Anglo sort of German clash that is going on against the background of the arms race, this ability to move anywhere. And as Henning, you know, Edelgard is everywhere and yet nowhere. I can't control her. This idea that actually constant movement in the open air just makes nonsense of the idea of territoriality. So I think space is really important in that ability to move, as you say. And many of von Arnim's female characters travel widely, don't they? So I mean, so that idea of Jennifer Shepherd's idea of kind of cultural feminism, I think I would subscribe to. Also the idea of a sort of modernity and an aspiration to modern. I agree with you that Jellyby is kind of the new man, and again quite an extreme version, but very, very, very interesting, I think, in that sense. It seems to me that most of her novels, it's about female resistance. I think you know, that seems to me that there are very, very few passive women in these novels. They're resisting whatever the social kind of narrative is. They're constantly pushing against it, I think.
And I think there's also a sense of sort of believing in a kind of self-made feminism. You know, there's I can't quote it exactly, but there's something like, if you don't like your lot, sort of pick up your skirts and take another. Sort of do something about it. And I think that sense of empowerment, of agency, that is, to me, that is deeply feminist. And I think we always have to be careful of reading sort of, well, in this case, pre-war feminism, the new woman feminism, against our own ideas of what constitutes, you know, feminism, and there has, have to be careful not to confuse the two. So I think that for her time, I mean, she really did speak up for women and for women's rights, be it from birth control, which you know is a topic in several of her novels, to women's self-determination, independence, freedom of movement. It's
interesting because that idea of romantic love being at the center of a woman's life is being kind of challenged in many of the novels, actually. So there are a lot of disillusioned women who get married and then it's not working for them. And I was thinking by the time she gets to Love in particular, which is kind of 1925, I think, and that's absolutely displaced. And in that particular novel, I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read the ending, but the romantic love that is at the center of Catherine's being, actually, throughout that, striving to attract a younger man and to keep a younger man, is really then displaced by something that is much, much more important than romantic love. And I think that's where you get that sort of development towards not just a pushing against, but a breaking out of these sorts of social conventions. It's very, very interesting.
I've always liked I think it's in Mr. Skeffington, sort of Fanny goes on around to all her former lovers, and there's somewhere a line in the novel that says she had always been so pretty, she had never had any need to grow. She had never had any need to sort of develop as a person. And suddenly that is forced upon her, and in a way she tries to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, I suppose the Caravan is that idea of a woman being attractive is also there, isn't it? Through the Baron perception. That's where value is. I mean, and it's kind of, you know, anybody that's read 19th century literature and onwards sort of understands that this is actually the currency for women, largely. And it's interesting to me that Frau von Exum is both can be both sort of physically attractive to the Baron, but also she's a widow. And it seems really important to me that she's a widow. So she's inherited, and she has a kind of freedom that other women do not necessarily have. And widows, as we know, are very important for von Arnim. They're a sort of the perfect woman, she says at one point, because they take on sort of the legal powers that their husbands would have had, as well as the financial independence that they have. So when she marries Jellyby, she marries somebody, of course, who is wholly reconstructed, in a sense, an ideal, as you put it. but in fact it feels much more like a sort of well-judged choice rather than buying into something that's actually socially sanctioned. I wonder, I'm interested in what Kate kind of thinks about this.
I was thinking that in the Caravanners, you've got a pretty big selection of women who are in different phases of life. So you've got the backers, the flappers, the two girls who are nothing but irritating to Otto because he cannot understand how anyone can tolerate them. And then you have Frau von Arnim, who is the desired object, who is a remarkable study of how women can endure intolerable men but still remain perfectly womanly. So Otto completely misleads himself as to Frau von Arnim's feelings towards him, but it's perfectly plain to the reader that she has to tolerate him because the social codes require that. And then you have Mrs. Menzies-Lee. It's such a difficult name to pronounce. Is it Menzies-Lee? Is it Menzies-Lee? I'm never quite sure. It's one of those names that never speaks aloud. Let's go for Menzies-Lee. She is the probing, very intelligent woman who probably is the key feminist. If we set Edelgard aside for a moment, she's the key English feminist because she knows perfectly well that Otto is a complete idiot and he is very domineering and has all these personality problems. But she also has to navigate the social codes, but she's able to do it in a much more direct way than her sister is able to. And that's a really interesting contrast. So you've got two women who are both very secure socially and financially and are at no risk of being taken advantage of because they have their own resources, but they deal with this tiresome man in quite different ways. So these are, if you like, pattern books of behavior that von is setting out, saying, look, you could do it this way or you could do it this way. And I find that's where all the jokes come from for me. And then we have Edelgard, who is blossoming into as much of a feminist as she can be, and Otto absolutely hates it, and that is just sheer joy. But the scene when Edelgard has finished shortening her skirts and descends from the caravan in a slightly new appearance, and Otto bursts out laughing and tells the reader how absolutely natural and acceptable and normal his reaction is by the Prussian way. And then the reader naturally contrasts this with what the English response is, which is, my goodness, how rude of that man to be laughing at his wife in that way. Let's just not notice it and not respond, because that's the only way the social codes will allow us. There is so much complex dissection of two separate cultures, as well as a masculine-feminine divide going on. That small episode, it's just masterly writing. She was a genius at that.
Yeah.
So can I just jump off of that, because I think that's really important, sort of the different stages and the different types of sort of levels of emancipation of different kinds of women. And if we indeed sort of consider Menzies-Lee, whatever it is, as sort of the most, shall we say, the most secure, the most progressed example of her sex, because I think that Frau von Arnim still actually feels quite oppressed by him and just by Ottringen, and is not fully doesn't feel as inwardly free. Then sort of her older sister is, because she does feel inwardly free and she doesn't feel touched by him, she can be kind and she can be generous. And all through the novel, she is the one who actually sort of tries to talk to him. She does it for the social codes, but I think she also does it out of a sense of generosity. Very late in the book, there's a scene in the Canterbury Cathedral where Jellyby and Frau von Arnim talk to each other, and she says that her older sister, or was it even Edelgard, or one of the two, said, yes, but she understands how lonely he is.
Yes. Yes.
So the deconstruction of a particular type of masculinity as not beneficial, neither for the women, but also not for the men.
I mean, it's so interesting, that section, isn't it? Because she tries to improve him slightly earlier on and says, try being kind. Try being kind. So she sort of takes on almost a maternal role towards him, as if somehow, if only he could see. And that's probably it's quite interesting to me that, you know, first person narratives, as we all know, you get is a kind of study in character, but it's such a clever first person. narrator, that in fact we've already intuited this. You know, we already feel that he's deeply lonely, and these sort of asides about being childless that he brushes off. You know, that, you know, there were two children, but he can't be a father because those children have died too quickly, that he can't be. And had there been children, he says. So there are all these little hints that help us to understand who he is, alongside Jellyby's kind of understanding of him as a tyrant. He says, you know, we do not like tyranny. So, but there are these sections where we are led through that first person narrator to understand him much more deeply than perhaps we're inclined to when we start reading the book. So this idea that satire is often a type, as you say, it sets up types that are really good targets for ridicule, and very few nuances, very few subtleties, so that the satire works because we're pushing against a type, actually becomes much more complicated as the novel goes on. I mean, I wondered what you thought about this first person narrator. It's masterly.
It's absolutely masterly. I mean, I've just reread the book, and it draws me in every time.
Yes.
Masterly because of it is so sort of involuntarily, he just reveals himself so much, and has absolutely no personal insight. It's tragic almost when you read it. It's like watching, it's a kind of cringe comedy. It always makes me feel of watching The Office.
Yes.
You know, when people really, really embarrass themselves and you just want to help them. But on the other hand, something that I've noticed about this first person voice is how incredibly well she manages to draw sort of the inner world of a man who is incredibly obtuse and also very convoluted. And she does it by playing, I think, English and German language off against each other. So it's a very artificial way of writing. It is somebody who's supposedly so fluent in English that he can produce very sort of architecturally complex long sentences. The structure is, of course, totally modeled on German sentence structure. And
Yes.
to try to to make sort of to translate that as directly as possible into English just makes you realize how utterly absurd, sort of, or at least from this particular perspective, it is. If this were in German, it would read sort of much more fluently. I would probably not even notice it that much. But because it is in English, I sort of step back and go like, whoa, this is this is quite something. And I think she handles it really, really well. But it's also, and I think it's also really cleverly, because he certainly shows himself in an very unflattering light, but because he does it himself, it's not nearly as hurtful and not nearly as cruel as it would be if this were actually other characters talking about him.
Yes.
And the way that he is held in the novel by the other characters who are, you know, always sort of, as you say, sticking to the codes, trying to avoid him, trying to sort of mediate, I think is a much more effective way of showing nuance, even though he is a completely overdrawn caricature, than it would be as if we got direct views from other people on him, which we don't really get that much. It's all sort of, because we get it through his lens, it's all reflected, it's all broken. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, it is. We get virtually everything through his lens, don't we? But there's something so meta about it, which I hadn't realised until I reread it. So this idea, these gaps between the performance of discourse, the things that he thinks he should be saying, and the things that will be acceptable, and those things that he's writing. So in a sense, it's also confessional.
Yeah.
So he's set up as if there's something true about the narrative, that he's going to be absolutely transparent with himself, although the red pen keeps being mentioned, that when he reads it aloud, so he's almost like Tennyson with Maud, I'm going to go to parties and read aloud the stories that we've had. He's going to take the red pen to it and take those things out that are not part of the social performance. I found that really interesting, and fascinatingly, he says at one point, sort of contrary, and von Arnim is sure to have known this, contrary to the way that we normally think about the operation of language, he says that essentially he privileges writing over speech because it can be edited. And what he doesn't want is, he doesn't want Edelgard standing over his shoulder. I mean, it's obviously a reference to Plato, reading the text and sort of guiding him in the kinds of things that he should be saying. So there's a kind of freedom in narrating oneself, I think, for him that is confessional, but we can read it as so constrained by the fact that it's also going to be edited, and it's also allied with this idea of a sort of external performance of what has happened, the story that he's going to tell about this amazing modern holiday that he's had to try and shift himself into a different position.
And I find it really, I think the Caravanners from the right, so from a technical point of view, it is perhaps her most skillful novel. I think this is utterly outstanding. And the way that, as you say, he slides, but she sets up something that is so hybrid. It is personal, it is a confessional, but it is meant for an audience.
Yes.
And to have these two, as you say, these two levels of the outer and the inner constantly sort of shading, sort of sliding between them, and they're constantly sort of brushing up against each other and chafing, I think it lends a depth to the character that we wouldn't get if it were just sort of a straightforward first person narration that didn't have the written element to it.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because we cease to be, just on that point really, we cease to be readers. He calls us hearers. If our hearers, there is something about the articulation of the idea that he sees as being performance. So it is sliding constantly, as you say, between those two situations.
And I think there's also sort of, it plays into the idea of an audience. So he doesn't have a particularly friendly audience whenever he tries to talk to anybody on the caravan tour. And we talked about his loneliness before, and he feels that he obviously cannot be open with his potential hearers and friends. And at some point he says, who says originally are friends, at some point he says, oh, maybe they're just going to be family. Sort of the circle seems to be shrinking. But in the Elizabeth novels, my idea always was that von Arnim constructs her audience very much as imaginary friends, and she talks about how in the solitary summer, how she's yearning for friends, how she's lonely, how writing is sort of her way of reaching out into an anonymous audience that she hopes has a friendly ear. And I wonder if we're finding something similar here with the Caravanners, that he constructs a friendly audience, because he doesn't have one.
No. No, he doesn't. No, and it's interesting, of course, because we know that von Arnim is writing for a wide audience and wants to be read. So she's actually, she's very good, I find, as well, in sort of along that kind of line, in being topical. So many of her novels actually feed into, so The Benefactress feeds into a kind of move towards ideas about utopia. A very complicated utopia, obviously, in The Benefactress. But she, again, here, she's aware that anti-invasion literature is at its height in 1909. As the First World War begins, it falls away. But again, she's sort of positioning this novel to be read. And she's positioning this novel for this community of readers, understanding where it might fit in terms of the actually deeply uncomfortable, often sort of national ideas that are there. In some ways, if you read a lot of this anti-invasion propaganda, it's actually quite tame. So it's quite interesting that she's always got an eye on readership, and moves actually in terms of the subject matter of her novels to tap into the sort of wider context, the wider literary context, as well as the sort of intellectual context, the kinds of things her friends are writing about and thinking about. But she does it in such a way that it's accessible, amusing, entertaining for us as readers and for her readership at the time.
And I think that element of audience, I mean, obviously was, as you say, was so crucial for her. But from memory, the reviews for the Caravanners weren't all actually that positive. There were people who felt that she had overdone it. Yeah. Surely the Germans can't be that bad, or half of the Germans will laugh at this as well. You know, I think that sort of some of the reviewers found the comedy a bit sort of unbalanced, I think, or just a bit cumulative. Sort of there was more of the same. But yeah, from what I know, the novel sold extremely well.
It did sell extremely well. I've got some of those reviews actually in front of me if people are interested. I've got quite a lot of them. I won't go through all of them, but some of the highlights. As you quite say, there are quite a few people. This is in the UK only. I'm very interested to know what people made of it in other places in the world. But in the Outlook and the Spectator, they found the book in poor taste, actually. And the Spectator, the reviewer said, that they deplored that the writer should have indulged her wit at the expense of a country in which she is domiciled. Well, of course, she wasn't, but that's by the by. One other critic thought she was irresponsible and said this is a book which by its myriad pinpricks aggravates the friction between the two nations. So for a popular novel, actually, that's quite a serious claim in some ways, quite a serious claim. But actually the Daily News loved it and said, not since Mr. Bernard Shaw invented Broadbent has a great national type been ridiculed to so merry a purpose. And then goes on to say, and this actually picks up on what you were saying about the lack of self-awareness that we're given from the Baron. It's impossible to convey anything like the adequate idea of the witty genius with which the portrait of the officer and gentleman is drawn. He is forever unconsciously revealing his disgusting self. If the book were not so comic, it would be bitter. There is nothing we like less than literature which is anti-German. But the satire in this book is so brilliant, the comic invention so rich, that the Germans themselves outside a narrow class will probably enjoy it as well as anybody. By far the most subtly amusing book we have read during the past year. So it really is sort of straddling that divide, which I suppose is commensurate with the political situation and the sort of concern about the tensions between two countries that had seen themselves as cousins and had been very, very close.
Yeah, and I think what I found interesting upon rereading the novel is that it was certainly very much of its time and very topical about sort of German-English tensions at the time, but the type of narcissist militarism or narcissist or authoritarianism really that she draws is so timeless. And it is politically, in my reading, is extremely up to date. You know, that she manages to distill something out of a particular historical moment that definitely transcends it, and that I think makes the Caravanners still very much worth reading today.
I mean, I agree. I hesitate to mention the name, but certain characteristics seemed almost Trumpian, and I'm sure many of us reading it in this context will have sort of would have felt that sort of political approach and that seeming superficial confidence as being
and interestingly enough, so particularly in the first couple of years of his presidency, Trump was also in his demeanor compared with the German Kaiser. So you get the triangle, but I think it goes far beyond. I think it goes far beyond Trumpism. I think it goes into a particular kind of political macho culture that we see rising in various corners, and it's never kind to women. It's always chauvinist.
It's something potentially, I think, about socially sanctioned male privilege, whether it's to do with the military or to do often with clerics. So if you're thinking about the pastor's wife, religiously sanctioned as well. So this idea of male privilege and its social sanctioning of one kind or another seems to be very important to her. There are all sorts of ways in which we might sort of see aspects of, she's obviously writing fiction, but aspects of her thinking about men, I think, being fed into the Caravanners and into Otto in particular. So I was thinking about what she says about her father. At one point, she says he was a just but irritable man with far too few skins for comfort. And it's the last clause that I'm thinking about, far too few skins for comfort. And we see that in Everard Weems in Vera, I think, who she characterizes as a schoolboy. So this idea of sort of being caught in the social codes, stifling what you were talking about in terms of self-development, actually, you know, the inability to move. With the Baron, there was just one period early on when I was rereading that I thought, we now understand why he's as he is in a very clear way, because he talks about duty and he believes in duty. And we really get the sense, I think, early on, that he talks about husbands as a guiding glowworm, I think, lovely and innocuous, but it's a very kindly guiding glowworm. But we can see that there's a sort of steel and determination at the base of it. But it is actually given to us in such a way, from his perspective, that it is an adherence to something he really believes in, which is this idea of male duty.
and I think it's also it is a brilliant portrait. I think also of the psychology of domestic violence and domestic abuse. All his thinking, and he's not the only character. Weem, another name I never know how to pronounce. Weems,
I think.
Yeah, Weems in Vera is another character who's so completely sort of closeted in himself. And the idea of duty is very much often, particularly in Ottringham, is connected to the idea, look what you made me do. The idea of it's your fault, it's not mine. I'm trying my best. I don't like what I'm doing. You make me do it, which is one of the sort of the crucial mechanisms of domestic abuse. It's a kind of victim blaming, and I think she was incredibly sharp-sighted. Sharp-sighted a word? Yeah, sharp-eyed.
So this idea of, I mean, Woolf talks about this, doesn't she? She talks about domestic tyranny and sees that tyranny, as she puts it, played out on the sort of national stage too. She sees it in Three Guineas as a domestic tyranny is sort of the starting point, the seed for national tyranny, she thinks, and she argues. Just while I've mentioned Woolf for a moment, I was thinking about the relationship between Edelgard and Otto, and thinking about portraits of marriage. And Kate was talking earlier about, however we pronounce it, Mr. and Mrs. Menzies-Lee, and their relationship, which seems to be a reasonably egalitarian one. But I was thinking how different this relationship is in the book, the main relationship between Edelgard and Otto, from Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, where actually it's relational. So if we're thinking about this idea that each of them needs something from the other, Mr. Ramsay needs sympathy and so on, and there's a kind of interplay between the two of them where actually they're building each other's identities. Now, obviously this is a first person narrator, so we've only got one point of view, but I was really struck by how little effect Edelgard has at any point on trying to reconstruct reconstruct Otto. I mean, there's no relationality in this text, is there, in that marriage?
No, and I think they're both also, and I'm sure we can sort of psychoanalyze Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, but they have a mature relationship. They're both in their own ways mature. They have found their roles. Whereas what I always find with Otto and Edelgard is, at least at the start, they're utterly childish. They're utterly immature, both of them. I mean, he's openly compared with the baby, but she is also taking on of the role of the little girl, and she grows, and he does not. And of course, the question is, will she be able to maintain that when she returns?
Yes,
it's chilling.
Yes, it is chilling. I mean, it's interesting towards the end, isn't it? Where, I mean, he sort of says she's falling naturally back into her place, actually, but he attributes it not to himself. He attributes it to the power of the society around her, that she's having to sort of fit in that way. And it's something else that von Arnim is constantly in her novels pushing against, these social narratives that define the identity of individuals within them, and she's constantly pushing in various ways against that, I think.
And then what I find sort of talking about sort of domestic abuse and social boundaries, I think the novel is a great portrait, also sort of a great analysis of how authoritarianism works on an everyday level. When he talks about the barbed wire fences that they that the ruling class needs to erect in order to maintain social difference, and how that is something that constantly needs to be reinforced. In a way, it's a very modern understanding, because it really sort of encapsulates the idea of performativity. Something needs to be done again and again and again, and you become the person who you are through acting, and duty plays a part in that.
Yes.
So I think it's a very modern kind of analysis of how an authoritarian society works.
It is, and actually he's overt about the problems of democracy, isn't he? At one point, he actually talks about democracy and sort of says, this is the problem. If you give everyone a vote, then you are going to lose those systems that have supported authoritarianism for so very long. So it's interesting to think about it in that way. I mean, Kate, you've not had much to say. We haven't given you much. We giving you much space.
We're just chatting away.
Oh, you've been on like a steamroller. It's been fabulous.
Well, we just wondered
I
if
think
you've got-
now would be a really good time for people to start thinking about questions. I'm going to flip the view to grid view. So if you want to wave your hand and unmute yourself with a question, please do, or type it in the chat. Carry on, and I will pick up what I can see. It could well be that I can't see you because we've got 25 people and I can only see 20 on my tiny wee screen. So if you have a question, could you unmute and start speaking? We'll try it that way.
Please ask a question.
Yes, Jennifer. Let's unmute you first.
Can you unmute Jennifer, please?
As the host.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do it. And I can't unmute her. Oh no.
Jennifer,
Jennifer,
can you unmute yourself?
She should be able to. Well, a lot of other people have unmuted, so I don't understand why Jennifer hasn't.
I have.
Oh, yes.
No, we
So
Go,
Jennifer.
Jennifer.
it was only a little thing that people often air the Baron in the husband. Now, what have you got to say about that?
I'm sorry, we didn't quite catch that, Jennifer.
Elizabeth's husband,
Yeah.
Henny.
Can you
is
come
sometimes
closer to the microphone? That seems to help.
sorry, can you hear me?
That's
Yes.
better.
Yes.
Carry
Yes,
on.
that's better.
All right, I will lean forward. Just any comparison of the Baron with the Count von Arnim perhaps should be discounted, because this is often sort of thrown in as a kind of accepted view. That's all I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, and I think we of us, all of us in the Elizabeth von Arnim Society, become quite uncomfortable when people talk about her writing only autobiography, and you know,
Exactly.
it minimizes her kind of imaginative capacities, I think. So, I mean, I think we can all agree that she is writing fiction, and I don't think any of us really feel that she's taking any one particular character and writing biographically about that character. She's using her experience, I think, and it's fragmented and fractured, and then it's brought together. But it is fiction. It's not.
Yes, she
autobiography.
creates a type from a sort of maybe many different examples that she has witnessed in Germany herself. She would create that kind of person, whether it be somebody like the Kaiser or possibly even some aspects of her own husband, but obviously not a complete portrait. Yeah, that's all
Yes.
I would like to
Thank you,
contribute.
Jennifer.
We have a comment here from Francis. Did other readers long for Edelgard to leave Otto and get her own life, or is it just me? Now, personally, at the end of the novel, every time I read it, I think, okay, I think we're seeing signs that Edelgard is going to start a long-term program of improving Otto, but the First World War is not very far away. Now, obviously, nobody could know that when the novel was first published. But I can see Edelgard getting free of Otto. I think by the time the war approached, she was putting herself in the right position. Isobel?
No. I think we're projecting our own view of life onto this kind of accepted view that they were living, the constraints of the time.
I mean, it is interesting. I want to say yes. I suppose I think it's the end of the book, not the end of Edelgard. That would be how I feel about it. And I think we can see those seeds of development. I'm just wondering if he picks them up at all, I wonder, and develops a similar character later on. But of course, with the First World War, as you say, Kate, you know, the opportunity to develop is there. In the UK, divorce isn't possible, and for a woman to divorce a husband is not possible until 1937. So that so actually legally leaving one's husband is incredibly complicated until 1937. So that's it's not an easy endeavor to break free. I don't know, Juliane.
And I think also in Von Arnim's novels, I think with the sort of scandalous exception of Fanny Skeffington, no woman divorces. But her project is always to sort of think about, is there a way of staying in a marriage and finding space for yourself, of making it somehow work. Even at the end of the novel you mentioned before, Love, sort of there's a sense of, there's no sense of them divorcing, there's a sense of them trying to find an arrangement. And my sense always was that if Edelgard has staying power, and if she's really the would she be the niece of her aunt Bockhugel, then you know, she might turn into a second aunt Bockhugel. And that wouldn't be worse. And she's also the one who, I mean, kind of goads him into writing. For a moment, I had a feeling that, I mean, obviously she wants him to, possibly it's an exercise for him, where she hopes he will reflect on it. But I think it's also a very clever way of managing him, of giving her a morning off. So it reminded me a little bit of the way that Charlotte manages Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. It's a way of keeping him at a distance, of making it work for her. It's pragmatic. Yeah.
And she predicts him very well, doesn't she? She says at one point, I know exactly what you're going to say, in exactly what order, repeatedly, and then she just leaves. So in actual fact, in terms of managing him, Von Arnim sets it up in such a way that he's not in the least bit unpredictable. She will be able to manage him if she wishes. So that's a lovely idea. And the aunt is a very interesting way of thinking about coercive control as well, and the way in which that aunt is regularly sort of brought into play to control Edelgard. But that would be a wonderful scenario if actually she becomes, in a sense, the model, the positive model that Edelgard moves towards. Actually.
We're running out of time, and I see that we have another question or another sort of comment lined up. Just very quickly, I find the old woman in Von Arnim is always independent. She is always a character that Von Arnim, particularly in younger years in the mountains, sort of looked forward to. I imagine she would be a gay old thing, that sense of having a sense of inner freedom. And I think that's maybe also what Aunt Bockhugel, and what also Menzies Lee was also an older woman, or at least relatively older than the rest.
Yes.
We've got a couple of very helpful links in the chat from Diana about the connection between suffragettes and the caravans and the caravan movement. I commend them to people to look at privately if you want to copy the links for yourself. But following that, we have a question from Anne. Could you please talk about the scene where when Otto overhears Jellyby and Frau von Exum discussing him in the cathedral?
It's another scene really of his absolute delusion, and the way that it's written, the skillful way in which it's written. We only have the dialogue, no names are mentioned, but we have been, in a sense, as Otto's hearers. I think we are there alongside, hearing from his perspective at that point, and we've been guided very carefully, I think, through this narrative to that point, so that we hear as he does at that point. And yet, because she has exposed the gap between his understanding and the understanding of the rest of the group, and we've intuited so much in that gap, we know that that they're speaking of him, even though he doesn't understand that. It's a wonderful moment when he thinks that Frau von Exum is in love with him rather than Jellyby. That sort of absolute delusion, the comedy of that. But again, it's the narrative perspective that we've been sort of trained to work through that leads us to that section, I think.
And I think it's also structurally a very important moment. I mean, it is kind of the culmination of everything. Not only does it take place in one of the most magnificent buildings, you know, and you know, a church as a place of communion, as a place of insight, of quiet meditation. But it is also structurally important for the novel. It is what we need to know as readers, because as a reader, I've been asking myself all along, how does Frau von Eckton feel about having invited him? And, you know, she at least tried to share some of the burden that kind of his sister has taken on of mediating, of entertaining him. And there's a moment we need that outside vision of him, and we need it. We need to know what the other characters are actually. I mean, we get it implicitly what they're thinking of him, but I think it answers a couple of important questions as well. And after that, everything is said. There is nothing else that can happen. You know, it needs to end. That's how I've always read that particular scene.
And it's quite short, isn't it, as well? It's 5 days into the into
and
the
I find wonderful that Edelgard manages to lose, I don't know, 10 pounds in 5 days.
I love what they do, you know, what happens with time there, because it feels like such a long time, and you know, that sort of psychological time is stretched right out, and then we realize at the end it's only 5 days. So it's very, very, very clever.
Yeah, you realize, I mean, for just by reading this, you kind of get a sense for how long those 5 days for the other characters must have been.
Yes.
That's a good point to move to the next question, which is the link between the author's life and the characters in the Caravanners. And I wonder if you could talk about what you can connect between the real life holiday that von Arnim took with her children, which inspired her to write this novel in the first place, and then put Prussians into it.
Yeah, so the trip that she really took, it is of course modeled on it. And if you start reading closely, you see a number of incidents that she has sort of woven into it as kind of as in jokes. So for example, she traveled with her 3 daughters, who are sort of compressed into the 2 nondescripts, her three elder daughters. And one of them indeed did fall ill, and I think it was Evie who got mumps, also sort of a disease where you swell up, of course, or parts of you swell up. So you can see these kind of, she traveled with some of the tutors, E.M. Foster and Hugh Walpole were of the company, and I think Charles Stuart Erskine as well, who would, certainly sort of have been sort of compressed into the different men. But she also visited, so the actual trip was of course a lot longer and was a lot more eventful. And so she visited Alfred Austin, who was sort of offered the literary model for the German Garden along the way, and she visited Henry James and importantly H.G. Wells, who was of course a great Fabian. And I always sort of thought that, I don't know what they talked about that they visit, possibly they didn't talk politics at all, but I always had a sense that the visit at Wells's place might also have inspired some of the sort of Fabian enthusiasm, some of the politics in the novel. And as a travel book, I think it is incredibly clever. Again, we talk about how clever she is, and it is because she takes this genre of the travelogue where you try to sort of show the reader a strange world, or if you travel through a familiar territory, which for the English readers would have been, you know, Sussex and Kent, you need to make it appear strange again. You need to make it exotic. You need to make it interesting. And she does that by sending a strange character through it, and we see it through his eyes. So this English society is sort of becomes a society of wonder, of something fantastic, something that he really doesn't understand. But of course, he is the alien body in this. It's not the natives. You know, the English would recognize themselves. But she plays, I think, very well with that trope of familiarity and strangeness, or something that is alien.
It's interesting when you talk about Wells as well, that visit to Wells. There is a whole page really that could be taken to be considered at least airing Fabian politics. The notion of free love is overt and so on. So you feel that Fabian influence there, I think, in that sense. I have just bought a camper van. And so reading this, it was quite interesting reading it again, because it's the detail of the discomfort, which is kind of interesting, that strangeness that you're talking about, and that idea, actually, that Fabian idea of moving towards a simple life, simplifying your life into such ways with a kind of idea of it being more moral to live in an austere, simple way. In some ways, it's a break from the social round that plays out in that novel. I think I haven't seen the link that Diana sent I think, but many of us will know that it starts a sort of, this book starts a philosophy of what's known as wayside wisdom, which fits alongside this idea of the simple life. And also that Molly Russell, the first wife of Frances Russell, writes a similar book in response to the Caravanners that doesn't sell very well, but she in a sense tries to ape this novel. We also know that from a feminist point of view that many women started trespassing in caravans all over fields in Sussex and Kent and started to take their holidays there. Quite interesting. So it has a real world kind of continuation in terms of trespass. Very interesting.
I didn't you asked me before about von Arnim's feminism, and I didn't talk about the caravanning, but we've already got the links in the chat. The suffragettes used the caravans because they drew so much it was for them a reasonably cheap and safe way of traveling and getting to remote corners, but they drew so much attraction that and so much attention that they always had a crowd. People would just flock to it because it was so strange and exotic.
Yes. Yes.
But going back to that idea of the exotic, von Arnim had been visiting England reasonably relatively, and she had recently returned to live there. But I think the years away in Germany have also sharpened her view on English society. And I always sort of thought her vision of England was, tinged with a sense of idealism and homesickness. But there's also, I seem to recall, and Jennifer can correct me, and it might be in All the Dogs of My Life, where she describes when she came back to England, she was sort of Germanified, and that she had had taken on some of that not authoritarian thinking, but this very class consciousness that she hadn't had before. And she very gracefully invited her guests to sit down when they had already been eating and chatting for half an hour. That she herself had that sense of Prussian stiffness, and she needed to get rid of it. And so, I wonder if during that caravanning tour, there was the one that she undertook, there was also a sense of reacculturing sort of yourself to sort of your English roots.
Yeah, this is interesting. She talks quite uncomfortably, I think, about foreignness, and it's her word, and this idea of being infected by microbes in the blood. In this case, it's Otto talking about British microbes coming into the German blood, but it's a similar sort of idea, I think. I mean, one of the things she's talking about, All the Dogs of My Life, the ultimate failing really for Otto is he doesn't like dogs. And if we were thinking about his characterization, the fact that we're told explicitly he does not like dogs, we need to know a little else about her attitude towards him, I think, at this point.
I think we do need to close this conversation because we're well over the hour now, and it is well known that an hour of Zoom is enough for any human being in one day. So thank you very much, Juliane. Juliane?
Sorry, just one thing. Could you maybe save the chat for us, because I haven't had a chance to read it. I will
do my best. Yes, I will save the chat. I'm going to do a formal wrap up, then I'll stop recording, and then we can cut and paste and do whatever. So thank you very much, Juliane, for giving up your evening to this in Australia, and thank you, Isobel, for asking all the questions and keeping that conversation going with effortless skill. It was admirable stuff. Thank you so much.
It's been fun.
Stop recording now.